Planning Subcommittee meeting. Mr. Chairman, staff is ready for you to begin.
Thank you. Good morning. Chair Dimitrios Karapanagiotis for the record. I'd like to call to order the May 11, 2021 meeting for the Regional Transportation Commission Metropolitan Planning Subcommittee. RTC staff will begin with a roll call of subcommittee members, introduce staff on the line, and touch on a few housekeeping items.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Reagan Lively, Management Analyst for the RTC for the record. I will be calling your name in alphabetical order. Please confirm your attendance as I read your name. Jody Betchel.
I'm here.
Mario Bermudez.
Here.
Daniel Catrone.
Here.
Rebecca Coutinho.
Here.
Susan Daniowick.
Present.
Nas Diallo.
Here.
Thank you. Mr. Don Johnson.
Here.
Mr. Chairman.
Present.
Bouchette Lesdema.
Here.
Johanna Murphy.
Present.
April Raybuck.
Here.
Victor Rodriguez.
Present.
Fred Solis.
Present.
And Kimberly Sullivan.
Present.
Thank you. Also, please note that we have several RTC staff on the line for today's meeting. This includes Mr. Andrew Kelman, Acting Director of Metropolitan Planning Organization, Ms. Ray Lathrop, Manager of Regional Planning, and Mr. Daniel Fazekas, Senior Transportation Planner. In addition, we also have Mr. Jim Chapman, Project Manager from the Urban Design for Health, and Mr. Greg Servins, Senior Planner for the Clark County Department of Comprehensive Planning. As the Chairman mentioned, I have a few housekeeping items to go over. Please state your name for the record before speaking. Be sure to mute your line if you are not speaking, but please note that staff will monitor line and mute any callers with background noise. Voting will be done verbally as a group, calling for ayes and nays. If there are no nays or abstentions, then the motion will carry. If there are nays, then a roll call vote will be required. In the event of a roll call vote, please wait for your name to be read to provide your vote. The chair will call for any comments or questions after an item has been presented. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Lively. I will turn it over to Mr. Kelman.
Thank you, Chairman and members of the subcommittee. Andrew Kelman, Acting Director of the MPO for the record. The first item on the agenda is to conduct your first citizens participation period. As you know, on March 22nd, 2020, the State of Nevada Executive Department issued Declaration of Emergency Directive 006, which suspended the requirement to have a physical location for public meetings. Pursuant to this directive and for health and safety of the community, this meeting is being held telephonically. To allow for public participation, the RTC is accepting public comments via email at publiccomments@rtcsnv.com. Comments can be submitted and read aloud or to be directly added to the written record. Ms. Reagan Lively, Management Analyst, will read the public comments received by the RTC.
Thank you, Mr. Kelman. Chairman Dimitrios Karapanagiotis for the record. This is the first time set aside for public comments. This time is limited to comments on items included on the agenda. Comments will be limited to the first 500 words, with the remaining words to be included in the written record. Ms. Lively, do we have any comments?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Reagan Lively for the record. There are no public comments at this time. Mr. Chairman, that concludes the initial public comments item.
Thank you, Ms. Lively. Moving on to Mr. Kelman.
The next item is to approve the consent agenda, which consists of items 2 and 3 and may be taken in one motion.
Thank you, Mr. Kelman. Chair Dimitrios Karapanagiotis for the record. Are there any comments or questions from the subcommittee? I hear none, so if there are no questions or comments, do we have a motion on the floor?
Hi, this is Johanna. Oh, sorry, I beat you, Mario. It's Johanna.
Let's go with Johanna.
Okay, I move to approve the consent agenda.
We have a motion for approval. All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? I hear none. The motion carries. Mr. Kelman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, Andrew Kelman for the record. The next item is to receive a presentation on the Southern Nevada Transportation Health Study. And we have Mr. Jim Chapman, Project Manager from the Urban Design for Health, here with us today for the presentation.
Good morning, committee members. For the record, I'm Jim Chapman from Urban Design for Health. I'm the project manager from the study's consultant team. This morning, I'll share a short overview of the transportation impacts on health study, initial findings from community engagement, and I'm also hoping to get your input on upcoming planning scenarios. Next slide, please. This project's completed in collaboration with the Southern Nevada Health District, the UNLV School of Public Health, and the Nevada Institute for Children's Research and Policy. Funding to support outreach is also provided by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's REACH grant. Next slide. Urban Design for Health leads the consultant teams. Its president is Dr. Larry Frank. For 25 years, UD4H has documented the impacts of built natural and social environment on physical activity, as well as the physical and mental well-being and health of people. The consultant team includes Purdue Marion and Associates, Alta Planning and Design, and the University of Arizona. Next slide. The project's technical advisory committee consists of members from the cities shown here, plus 2 agencies focused on health, as well as students and professors from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Next slide. The study's goals are to help expand the conversation and awareness about opportunities on how to integrate transportation and health, and how that integration can actually help meet the needs of both fields, transportation and health. It's also to estimate current health and transportation conditions and apply those methods and tools to evaluate future scenarios. We will also identify a set of performance measures which can be tracked over time, indicating how transportation health impacts are changing. Next slide. We began the project at the end of 2020. We'll finish in the first quarter of 2022, with the vast bulk of the work completed this year. The primary tasks are shown here. Due to limited time, today I'll focus on sharing findings from Task 2, Community Engagement, and get your thoughts on scenarios, Task 5. If you'd like a deeper dive, findings from the data collection and economic analysis will be uploaded soon to an RTC project webpage, or you can email Deb Reardon. Next slide. Engagement with the community, transportation, and public health practitioners and decision makers is a foundation to the project's success. Through these efforts, we will foster increased awareness of the connections between public health concerns and how we travel and design our communities. We've done this work with focus groups, interviews, and partner presentations. Next slide. The input from this engagement effort really described 2 groups: people who rely on transit and walking and biking, and those who don't need to. Some of the key issues or themes we heard included things like most don't see public transportation as a desirable travel option. There were expressed concerns about unsafe sidewalks and their condition, a lack of bike lanes, excessive speeds, crime and the fear of crime and how that could impact people's choice or willingness to ride transit and bike and walk. Several people provided comments that really connected to this idea that transportation has a ripple effect on people's lives. Of course, it connects people to jobs and healthcare and food and parks. A few people commented on just some of the mental health impacts of isolations, especially if you have limited travel. And just to note, this engagement effort, has happened recently, so during the COVID era too, with enhanced isolation for some. Next slide, please. And so in addition to that input, people had ideas and recommendations as well. And some of these include safer bus stop shelters, providing light rail in the region, increasing and expanding transit routes and frequency, improving sidewalk conditions and street lighting. There was interest in creating a green belt through town, improved crosswalks. Some comments under communications. One was related to the idea of municipalities being more accountable for their transportation decision-making, affordable housing needs, interest in expanding safe routes to school programs to additional schools, and also related to communication and messaging with a need for messaging for each target population in future transportation plans, so customized messaging. And we had a number of health practitioners and others engaged in the healthcare service, and there's interest in the idea in their mind of connecting transportation to health. And one of the things that came to mind was that people who lack transportation, reliable transportation, can miss medical appointments. And that, of course, has downstream effects on health conditions. And so an interest in understanding that better. All right, next slide, please. So that was a very quick overview of some of what we heard from the engagement process. And now the task 5, which is related to scenarios of future conditions, where we will develop them and analyze their impacts on health outcomes and healthcare costs. At Urban Design for Health, we've done work similar to this with several agencies, including the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, multiple metropolitan planning organizations in San Joaquin, San Diego, Southern California, cities of Madison, Wisconsin, and Toronto. And so this is despite our having done that work in those places, this is a very innovative project. And RTC is helping to lead this effort to explore how to better integrate health into the work you already do. Next slide, please. So the task at hand for the project right now, and where we'd like to get some input from you, is relating to creating a scenario. And so that means selecting, describing, and then we would analyze the health impacts of that future scenario, which is representing future changes that affect people's travel choices and behavior, things like availability and costs and efficiencies. The scenario can also describe changes to the impacts of how we travel, such as safety and pollution generated. Some of the things we've been thinking through as we consider different scenarios to develop include, has it already been discussed? Is it identified as a goal? Is there a policy or a study already out there that we could take a next step and look at the health impacts of it? Is there some future change that's being considered that would be a particularly good example to bring in health into the transportation planning process of that effort? And similarly, is there a particular effort that might be more likely to occur if health impact information was brought into the decision-making process? And so for us, describing a scenario involves indicating what's to occur, where, and with sufficient detail that we can estimate what the impacts are on people's physical activity, walking and biking, exposure to pollutants, noise and air, and how many people are impacted. Next slide. And so this is the discussion slide. No, I'm sorry, it's the next one. First, this is leading up to it. This slide gives examples of what we have to work with. What are the future changes we might consider, and what might their impacts be on health? For example, we can make changes to the transit system. We could provide a built environment and supportive land use that makes it easier, safer, and more convenient to walk and bike and take transit. And through a variety of ways, we could seek to decrease pollution and people's exposure to it. And making these types of changes typically results in a healthier community. So these are kind of the levers we have. Next slide. This is the one. And so we've created this list of ideas, themes, just something to start a discussion. For example, a scenario that we might analyze the health impacts could involve changes to the transit system. And what are those changes? Frequency, new routes, where are they? And then that information would be used to estimate the health impacts of more people taking transit and likely walking and biking more too. Or a scenario could be posed that says, I'd like to know the health impacts of twice as many people walking and biking in the future as they do now. And similarly, you can imagine a future where people can more conveniently and safely walk to desired destinations. And what might the health impact of that be? Of course, the region's already looked into the future with Access 2050, Southern Nevada Strong, as well as many other planning efforts. There are goals, policies, and projects from that work which could be fashioned into future scenarios to evaluate. And with just that very quick presentation and this set of ideas, we'd appreciate, if there's time, Chairman, any reactions to these ideas. What's missing? Are there other themes or ideas that you might suggest? Do you have preferences for anything here? This request of you is part of a series of requests we've been making with different stakeholders associated with the project. And I'll pause there if there's anyone who'd like to share any thoughts about this.
Thank you, Mr. Chapman. Are there any comments or questions from the subcommittee?
Hi, this is Jody Bechtel, for the record. I'm always interested, I mean, it surprises me that it's never mentioned our climate as something that discourages people from walking and biking more. You know, there are several months where it's just miserable out there. And so, you know, whether we look at it as like an urban heat island effect or something like that, but that might be something we consider looking into more and, you know, working on. I mean, several of us are working on that, what to do about that, but just seems like it's missing here. This
is Jim Chapman. And certainly that did come up in the public engagement, it was definitely brought up in different ways, and trying to think how we might create a scenario out of that, and certainly different ways to do that. Anyone else?
I hear none. Mr. Chapman, that concludes your presentation?
I just had 2 more slides if I have time.
Sure, go ahead.
Just wanted to let you know our next steps. We're working to define these scenarios this month of May, and we're really just beginning a conversation about the next task, about performance measures, and identifying what would be best for you to use to track changes over time in transportation's impact on health. And the next slide is my last slide. This concludes my presentation, and if you have any additional questions, I'd be glad to answer them.
Are there any questions from the subcommittee? I hear none. Thank you, Mr. Chapman. If there are no more questions, we can move on to the next item. Mr. Kelman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Andrew Kelman for the record. The next item on the agenda is to receive an update on the Stadium District Transportation Plan. And with us today, we have Mr. Greg Servin, who's a senior planner for the Clark County Department of Comprehensive Planning, here to provide a presentation.
Thank you, Andrew. My name is Greg Servin. I am a senior planner of the Clark County Department of Comprehensive Planning, and I'm here today to talk about the Stadium District Plan. Next slide. So the lead agencies for this project are Clark County and the RTC, and we have our primary consultants, which are Raffi Architecture, which handled the land use side of the plan, Atkins, which handled the transportation side of the plan, and we also have our sub-consultants, Kimberly Horn, Paceline Consulting, and Erica Villas Consulting. Next slide. So the Stadium District is a 1.25 square mile area around Allegiant Stadium that is bounded by Tropicana Avenue to the north, I-15 to the east, and the Union Pacific Railroad to the west and south. Next slide. The objectives of the plan are to develop an overall vision for the district, provide a toolbox of solutions that will guide the implementation of the vision, and identify potential investments, and also to inform the Transform Clark County Master Plan Development Code rewrite that is going on currently. Next slide. So this slide, I'll just kind of glance over, goes over the planning process that we went through, the different phases. You know, the initiate phase where we collected data on the area, also studied best practices from other stadium district areas in the country. Also, we identified key stakeholders too. And in the explore create phases, we developed visions and goals. We also did various analysis, and also we met with our stakeholders through various meetings. And then we get into the validate and deliver process where we develop the draft plan, and right now we're gathering feedback and moving towards creating the final plan. Next slide. So as far as public engagement activities, we had a project website where people could go to learn about the project and also to keep up to date. We also conducted 2 public surveys, which we received over 764 survey responses. We held 4 stakeholder technical advisory committee meetings. And the stakeholders consisted mainly of property owners, business owners, tenants. We also had representatives from UNLV and the Raiders. We had town board representatives. And we also had members from local government and quasi-government agencies. We also conducted a pop-up meeting at Sam Boyd Stadium during a UNLV football game where we conducted a survey and engaged the public. We also met with a number of professional and business associations, such as the Tropicana Business and Community Coalition and the NIOP Government Affairs Committee, amongst others. Next slide. So from the surveys and the public engagement, we learned a number of things. We learned that people wanted the district to be a mixed-use community. They wanted it to be a safe environment that had amenities, including entertainment and restaurant uses. They wanted the district to be family-friendly, a place where they could feel comfortable taking their children. They also wanted to see public open space incorporated into the district as it develops. People also wanted the district to be walkable and pedestrian-friendly and also have multimodal transportation choices, such as walking and biking and transit options. They also had some concerns with infrastructure. With the existing streets in the district, the sidewalks are very narrow, so people wondered how the streets would be able to handle the influx of people. There are also some concerns about how utilities would be able to handle future development. Some people also had some concerns about parking, but since the time we did the survey, Raiders have developed a parking plan and also have added to their the available parking that's in the area. So although people are still concerned because the stadium hasn't been fully opened yet, and so people are still wondering how it will turn out. Next slide. So the existing conditions in the district has a number of issues. Right now, the built form of the district is intended to accommodate industrial uses, where it's basically designed to handle semi-truck traffic, not so much people and regular vehicles. The district has very large industrial blocks right now, which makes it very difficult for pedestrians to meander through the district and to get around. Buildings right now are set back behind large surface parking lots, so that makes it very hard for pedestrians to be able to get to the buildings from the street. Amenities and services are lacking in the district, and right now the grid network is very non-connected within the district. If you look at the graphic to the right, a distance of a quarter mile as the crow flies, you can see that it could take someone maybe up to over 15 minutes to actually walk that distance, the current grid today. Next slide. Other issues include that streets and lighting are not designed for pedestrian and bike movement and comfort. If you look at the photo on the lower left-hand corner there, you can see how dark some areas of the district are, which makes a pedestrian feel very unsafe walking around in the area. Some of these other photos, you can see the sidewalks are very narrow, which doesn't allow you to accommodate large crowds. Also, pedestrian crossings are limited to signalized intersections. Like I mentioned earlier, the blocks are very long, so someone would have to walk quite a distance just to be able to get to a crosswalk to cross the street. And the district lacks infrastructure that supports new uses. Next slide. So during one of our first stakeholder meetings, we developed a vision for the stadium district, which is create a dynamic district with a comprehensive mix of uses that supports the continuation of current businesses while providing opportunities to transition into a thriving destination for entertainment, hospitality, business, and sports. Next slide. We also developed a number of goals to support the vision. The first goal was to promote flexibility within the built environment to accommodate both event day and non-event day functions. The second goal was to provide connectivity and access to and throughout the district to improve mobility by encouraging the use of alternative modes of transportation. Next slide. Goal number 3 was to enhance quality of life by creating a vibrant district with best practices for urban design. And the last goal was to promote a vibrant economy by enabling multiple options that support individual property and business owners' intentions to remain or transition to new uses. And the key with that last goal is just to point out is that we're not trying to force anybody out of the district. If a business wants to stay there, they're more than welcome to stay as long as they want. Next slide. So during another one of our stakeholder meetings, we did a land use visioning exercise. And basically, with the stakeholders, the general theme that came out with the stakeholders is that they wanted to see commercial and entertainment uses closer to the stadium, while maybe keeping the industrial uses closer to the railroad. They also wanted to keep residential uses out of the airport environs to avoid conflict with the McCarran International Airport. And if you see on the graphic, that yellow line, dashed line, shows the airport environs line. Everything south of that is the airport environs. But the bottom line, the stakeholders wanted to express the desire to have the flexibility on their property to have a variety of uses and or mixed uses. Next slide. In the plan, there's a section dedicated to building design and massing, and the plan encourages minimizing building setbacks, basically moving the buildings up to the street frontage, while also activating the ground floor with commercial and office uses. By doing so, it makes it easier for pedestrians to get to the buildings and also creates a livelier street frontage. The plan also encourages awnings and covered patios in order to provide shade for pedestrians or maybe for like an outside dining area. I also want to widen pedestrian pathways, and the plan also talks about building height. So as the building gets taller, we like to see the buildings to step back in order to avoid a canyon effect on the street. The plan also encourages rooftop gardens and patios. Next slide. The plan also talks about and encourages open space and public art. Right now in the district, there really isn't any open space at all or public art. By adding open space public art, it will help improve health, increases value of surrounding land, enhances the appearance and beauty of areas, provides sustainable benefits, increases sense of community and engagement, and also establishes a place-making potential for the area. Next slide. Right now, the block development in the district consists of very large blocks, as you can see on the graphic to the right, which basically allows few routes for pedestrians to get around in the district and reduces the connectivity for pedestrians to get around. Next slide. So the plan encourages with future block development, increased permeability with these blocks by trying to break up some of these larger blocks, whether that might be private street or if it's just a pedestrian pathway. The main point is to try to break up the blocks to increase permeability, to make it easier for people to walk around in the district, to get around in the area. Next slide. And with future block development, we'd like to see the buildings pushed out towards the edges of the block in order to engage with the street frontage. We'd also like to have the parking on the interior of the block behind the building so vehicles aren't the emphasis of development in the area. We also like to have pedestrian pathways within the blocks. It can be meandering, doesn't have to be a perfect 90-degree angle or anything, but this will help make it easier for people to get around, and it also allows for buildings to be connected through the interior of the block also. And if so desired, people can also incorporate open space within the interior of the block if so desired. Next page. So the plan talks about street design, and it encourages complete streets where we prioritize pedestrian and bike activity. It also wants to integrate public and private pedestrian areas and also find opportunities for amenities with the street design. Next slide. So on the graphic on the right shows what an ideal grid could be within the district. It also divides the streets up into different street typologies. We have the neighborhood streets with the orange color, which are the 60-foot local streets. We also have the festival streets, which are also 60-footers. But those streets that would have a flush curb, which makes it more ideal for festival type events such as maybe a farmer's market or an art show or art festival. We also have the main street type, which are the 80-foot collector streets. And then you have the multimodal street type, which are the 100-foot arterials. Then the event streets, which are just the streets adjacent to the stadium. And then we have the industrial street type, which are streets, as you can see our Western Valley view here, that might be okay to leave as for industrial type uses for now, but maybe in the future phases as development continues, it might transition to a neighborhood street type. And then we have the pedestrian pathways that I mentioned earlier with those dotted lines. But as I mentioned, they don't have to be perfectly plus sides like they're shown here. They could be meandering, or the main key is to try to break up the blocks to allow pedestrians to get around. And on the left shows some of the guiding principles that we use to develop the street network and typologies, which are provide an interconnected street network that supports compact development patterns and alternative mode connectivity, prioritize walking and bicycling as the primary mode of movement within the district, provide safe, efficient, and comfortable routes for all modes to increase the use of alternative modes of transportation, integrate the district's transportation network with the region's transit to maximize alternative mode choice. We also want to integrate smart technologies to the district's infrastructure and also incorporate urban open space. Next slide. So within the plan, with each street type, there's a number of street cross-section options. So for example, one street type might have bike lanes, or another option might have bike lanes and parking, or another one might have neither. So there's different types of options. So this example here that you see before you is a neighborhood street design example, which happens just to have bike lanes and parking. You also notice on the edges of the street, there's a pedestrian zone or realm, which allows for a widened pedestrian pathway for people to get around in the district. Next slide. This slide just shows a festival street design example where you have the flush curbs, which makes it easier for people to walk around in the street area for a festival. And also, this option happens to have an activated median in the middle. Next slide. So with the pedestrian realms on the edges of the streets, there's an attached sidewalk option and a detached sidewalk option. But both options have an amenity zone, which is where you would find your landscaping, or maybe like a decorative trash receptacle or benches, things like that. You also have your walkway or clear zone, which allows for an unimpeded pathway for pedestrians to walk down. And then you have your building edge and setback, where you can have the building either set back at 0 feet right up against the walkway, or it can be set back up maybe up to 20 feet to allow for maybe outside dining or some outdoor open space area. Next slide. So this map shows the different modes of transportation in the district all put together into one map here. The purple shows the existing and possibly proposed transit routes that would be through the district. The blue line shows the proposed Vegas loop that the Boring Company is proposing right now. You also have the orange lines, which shows proposed bike routes. Then you have the green lines that show the streets, maybe possible streets to allow for sidewalks and for people to walk on. And next slide. So as far as next steps, we'll be meeting with the Executive Advisory Committee with the RTC on May 27th. And then we'll be going before the Planning Commission on June 1st, and then the Board of County Commissioners on June 2nd, where they would be deciding whether to accept the plan. And with that, next slide. I thank you for your time, and if there's any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them.
Thank you, Mr. Servan. Any questions from the subcommittee? I hear none. If there are no more questions, we can move on to the next item. Mr. Kelman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next item on the agenda is to receive a presentation on the regional housing forecast, which is being led by the regional planning staff. Ms. Ray Lathrop, Manager of Regional Planning, will present this item.
Awesome. Thank you, Chair. Ray Lathrop for the record. The regional planning team has been working on a number of research projects this past year, which we've presented to this group about heat and sustainability planning. Today, I'll be presenting on our regional housing forecast research, where we've had 2 technical advisory group meetings consisting of staff that are planners or within community development departments. And so some of you have heard this presentation before, but I hope that's okay. Next slide, please. Just as a reminder, these are the housing goals within the Southern Nevada Strong Regional Plan. These are mostly pertaining to how our future housing stock can support our residents and our economy. So having housing that meets the needs of workers and making sure that housing is accessible for all residents and ages as well as their needs. Next slide, please. So to frame our research, we've looked at studies from Washington, D.C., San Francisco, and Reno that looked at pieces of future housing differently. They analyzed different data sources and models to examine the balance between jobs and housing, the affordability needs of their communities, and the housing preferences by various demographics. So in our TAG meetings, we've discussed the pressing needs for Southern Nevada's housing research, but generally concluded that all of these different pieces and perspectives, which are intersecting pressures on the entire housing sector, are really kind of important. We've met with partners that also comprise of our regional land use working group in order to validate some of our information and think through with some other experts as far as some ways that our research could go. And we discussed this project with other community stakeholders like the Las Vegas Global Economic Alliance to think about how housing intersects with future economic development strategies. With all of this research, the team revisited those 3 studies and concluded that with our time, we could replicate some of those pieces. And so we know those are really complicated and interconnected, but as we researched, it was apparent that we could look at those 3 pieces kind of separately and see how we might be able to learn from each of them. So ultimately, we've decided to create a separate research brief for each of the pieces of housing future forecast. And currently, those research briefs are drafted and with our TAG members as well as some other stakeholders to be reviewed before we finalize them. And we will be publishing them on our website once we are completed with those reviews. But today I'll be sharing some of the high-level conclusions and interesting details that we found through our research. Next slide, please. Just a really quick summary. We did use the Envision Tomorrow Balanced Housing model in our work. This model was used during the SNS planning phase as well. So several of our planners in the local jurisdictions are familiar with this. It's an open source model that uses today's population and our 2050 population projection to look at supply and demand and affordability. It relies on Esri Tapestry data, which uses census information to segment our population into 64 different categories based on a lot of metrics to create some age stage cohorts. So if you're interested in learning about that work, we can always share that as well. Next slide, please. So the first piece of research that we examined was the jobs housing balance, and I have to give credit to our senior regional planner, Michelle Laramie, for the work on this component. The jobs housing balance is a common methodology for determining housing goals and needs, primarily just because it's a really simple equation to look at how jobs relate to housing units. It's not really a numerical data that we can take away from too much, but it does get us a good kind of look at balance. And we also know that this can be applied to some spatial difference as well. And, you know, with spatial changes of those jobs and housing stock, we know that transportation costs really implicate some of the accessibility of our housing. So what we see here on the table on the left is the jobs and housing balance over the past decade, which has steadily increased from 1.32 in 2010 to a regional high of 1.58 in 2018. And when we look out in the future years, it looks to be around 1.43, which is, continues to show that our jobs are outpacing our housing. And then spatially too, we know that we're continuing to kind of plan and develop those two separately. Depending on what kind of balance that we want for the region, the jobs and housing balance could help us to look at some housing goals. And so you can see on the graph here on the right that depending on which jobs and housing ratio we're interested in kind of setting as a goal, our future could see both either, I guess, a surplus or a shortage of housing units based on some of those projections. So this isn't really something we can use too much as far as a diagnosis tool, but something we can absolutely use and incorporate as far as some goals, as far as what a healthy balance of jobs and housing really means. Next slide, please. We also looked at what past scenario planning and some recent growth forecasts can tell us about a jobs and housing balance. So during that Southern Nevada Strong planning phase, 2 scenarios were developed which represented 2 possible growth scenarios. The baseline scenario, which looked at kind of the historic growth patterns of the past, as well as the preferred land use vision, which is here on the left. This is, using the community input and a lot of the surveys that informed the vision of Southern Nevada Strong. This is kind of what the jobs and housing balance and activity and economic growth was kind of ideal for a lot of the planning phase. So in that scenario, there's still growth around the edges of the region, but there's more investment in the core, near transit corridors, and future employment centers overall. The RTC has also done some growth forecasts for the region as part of the RTP, and in the most recent forecast on the right here, it shows that based on current zoning and policies in the region, our future growth looks a little bit more like that baseline scenario of kind of the way we have grown in the past. So the main takeaway here is that jobs and housing are projected to continue to be dispersed through the region, which is likely going to increase the amount of time our residents spend on driving and the amount of money they spend on transportation costs. But we should note that this is all based on existing zoning and land use maps and projections. And so we know right now that Las Vegas is adopting its new master plan, which does include some additional changes to the development code and density, and so that could change. Henderson is in the middle of changing some of its development code as well, and of course Clark County is undergoing Transform Clark County. So it's possible that in the next iteration of the RTP, these maps would look different as well. So there is a lot of research out there that shows that more compact development can help alleviate housing pressures like affordability and the cost of transportation, which aligns with the complete community theme in the regional plan. So we're thinking about using some of this to inform future research to think about exploring jobs housing balance in the region and other connections that housing location might have on all of our individual local government work. Next slide, please. So affordability is a huge concern and something that I think everyone is well aware of the pressures currently. This is the second piece of our housing research that we did. And Paul Gully, our management analyst, did the majority of this research. There are a lot of studies and data points that look at housing prices that have been increasing very consistently in the recent years, and some might say skyrocketing, making some of our local housing stock a little bit less attainable, less affordable. Let's see. Next slide, please. I think I got lost here. Oh, no. Oh, we lost one. So really quickly, we know that earnings have been falling compared to the cost of housing. So housing has continued to go up, whereas wages have been stagnant over time. So really quickly, we're just going to look at one of the relationships of some of our housing stock here. Next slide, there'll be some animations. Yeah. And one more there. Perfect. So you can see, oh, thanks. You can see here that we have a disproportionate availability of housing at our lower income versus our higher income income levels. So we have actually found within our research that there are 144 households which fall within the income brackets, which is under 35,000 who rent. So this is just looking at rental households. But there are 60,000 units available to them at that income level. So there's quite a shortage when it comes to the lower income of our income scale, which forces the majority of our lower income households to occupy rental units that could be outside of their price range or quite possibly doubling up with families and in order to have additional income earners. We talked about this in the research brief. One of the factors of some of this really low stock in the low income brackets is that our community has a significantly low amount of HUD-assisted units, like subsidized affordable housing, compared to the national average. At the end of the spectrum, over on the right side of this graph, the region has an oversupply of higher-end rental units, which is, something that we've seen grow over time significantly. All right. So affordability is its own report where we actually look at additional changes between renter households and owner households and the rent and cost burden of the community overall, in addition to projections of how that might change over time. So we are happy to share some of the research that we've created with anyone who's interested in kind of reviewing some of the findings of our reports, as we are also finalizing them through our TAG and stakeholder meeting. Next slide, please. Great. So the last piece of the housing research was looking at housing type. The Southern Matter Strong Plan really talks a lot about diversifying our housing stock. Research really suggests that housing type demand is based on 3 kind of demographic factors, which are a resident's age, a household size, and income. So I wanted to show you here on the left is the current existing stock of housing by type. Here we see that, of course, about 60% of our housing type is single-family detached housing. And this is a pretty similar to a lot of communities of our same age and location. On the right side, here is a graph comparing the owner and renter occupied units by type. So our single family units are primarily owner occupied, whereas our multifamily units are primarily renter occupied. And I think it's important when we think about how all of these different components intersect, that housing type and affordability and location are all kind of interdependent as well. Next slide. In the Envision Tomorrow model, we actually look at what those preferences may be because, like I said earlier, the Envision Tomorrow model looks at those age stage cohorts. So first, on the left here, we're looking at the population changes projected from the CBER population projection, so that in 2050, we actually see a significant increase in our community residents that are over 65 years of age, almost a doubling in of their proportion in the population. At the same time, we see almost no growth in the change of those that are under the age of 15 years old. So it looks by and far that our community will be aging, and then it's possible that our family sizes will be decreasing. So again, housing type research shows us that the age of household, the size of the household, and the income of the household changes the preference of housing type. So on the right here, we have comparison graphs of the occupied housing stock within Clark County, which is that second bar. And we have both single family homes in a large lot and a small lot broken apart, but together that's about that 60% that we showed you in the last slide. The Envision Tomorrow model compares that to, based on our current population, what their type preference may be in today's terms. So today's population may actually be desiring more large single family homes than we currently have. but the preference in 2050 significantly changes based on today's stock, going down to 24% of the population would likely prefer a large single-family detached home. And so we can think about, what this could mean for our future stock as we plan for future housing. We have a separate research brief for all three of these housing kind of pieces and components. And if you're interested in seeing any of them, we'd be happy to share. Next slide. So we're just really kind of excited about this research as we think that it lends to further implementation of the regional plan as we kind of dive into different pieces around how to diversify our housing stock or accommodate all of our residents in our future housing stock. Our next steps are to finalize our research briefs, which again, we're happy to share with any of you in order to get your feedback or thoughts on them. We're also continuing housing research in our next year's work program, which means that we'll be gathering input on any remaining questions that we have within these topics or any new questions that we may focus on. And also, it's our aim with these three documents to provide background or any statement of need for future planning or future housing strategy. So we hope that some of the narrative and the background that we've provided in these research briefs can help you apply for applications for funding or for future studies because, we've kind of distilled all of these interconnected components into their own story. Our team is able to help partner with you in adapting any of this research into your own funding applications or any work that you're doing at your local jurisdictional level. Next slide. With that, I'll take any questions if you may have some, but thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Lathorpe. Are there any questions? I hear none. We can move on to the next item, Mr. Kelman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next item on the agenda is to receive an update on the Livable Center Study Program led by Regional Planning staff. And with us today, we have Mr. Daniel Fazekas, a Senior Transportation Planner, to present.
Thank you, Andrew. Daniel Fazekas for the record. This morning, I will provide an update to the Livable Center Study Program and announce that a call for partners release will occur this summer for Livable Center Study 3. Next slide. A reminder, the Livable Center Study Program, Livable Center Study Program is led by the RTC in partnership with a selected local jurisdiction in Southern Nevada. The city of North Las Vegas was selected for Livable Centers 1, and it was completed in late 2019. And the city of Henderson was selected for Livable Centers 3 around the same time. The program has been essentially on hold due to COVID, but with things opening up, the RTC felt it was time to begin LCS 3. This is the process this summer. Next slide. So what is a livable center? A livable center is typically a vibrant, walkable community that offers increased mobility options with a mix of higher density residential and commercial uses. Next slide. Livable centers encourage healthy lifestyles, provides improved equitable access in a wide variety of jobs, housing, resources, and services. The program supports many goals and strategies of the Regional Transportation Plan, RTP Access 2050, Southern Nevada Strong Regional Plan, and the Onboard Mobility Plan. Next slide. Next slide for that, please. And one more, please. A typical LCS study area is scaled, and I think it's a double slide. Click on that. I'm sorry, I apologize. Thank you. A typical LCS study area is scaled at a pedestrian or bicyclist realm. So typically it's a downtown urban core, town centers, employment centers, a corridor or main street, or a neighborhood. Next slide. A successful LCS brings together regional and local visions based on best practices in transportation, urban planning, and design. Stakeholder and community feedback is a must, and to bring it all into one vision for the study area. Next slide. The result of an LCS study area could include potential housing choices, transportation options, and jobs, potential public-private partnerships, and at the very least, create a focal point or a place where people can get out and meet. Next slide. A couple things of note when it comes to the Livable Centers Study Program. It's modeled after Houston's and Atlanta's MPOs. Their programs have been around for about a decade or so. When it comes to our particular Livable Center Study Program, local jurisdictions are the lead for the studies. So RTC will obviously lead this selection of the jurisdictions, run procurement, but once that's all complete, we basically essentially hand it over to the jurisdictions to run the program. RTC will be there for capacity building, provide regional perspective, obviously processing invoices, and the administrative needs. But essentially, this is your project, the jurisdiction's project from start to beginning. And funding may be available once if whatever implementation comes out of your project. Funding may be available in future programs. Next slide. Next slide, this, please. So there are a few requirements that jurisdictions must meet to apply for LCS. First, the locations have to be in Clark County. They have to have multimodal transportation enhancements, link transportation and land use, and whatever street network reimagining or redesign, it must comply with complete streets principles. The big one, though, is having stakeholders and or landowners, businesses, HOA, or community groups adjacent to or within the study area show their support for the project. It's really necessary for success. Since we're redesigning or reimagining a study area, people who live or work or play within that area need to, employers, community organizers, whoever lives or works in that study area need to show support for the study throughout the whole study from beginning to the end. And again, community engagement is a requirement for this process. Next slide. And again, some deliverables could include an existing conditions report, public engagement report, vision and goals, concepts of different designs, or what the study area could look like, cost estimates, and implementation steps for whatever comes out of this study or the plan. Next slide. So for the schedule, this is for the call for partners schedule, and this has changed even a little bit since we've created this presentation. So we'll have a call for partners release probably in July now. That process will take about 6 weeks. It's an application process. RTC will work with local jurisdictions on developing that application, answer any questions, making sure it's aligned with regional goals as well as your goals. Once the selection is made, RTC will then work with the local jurisdiction to develop a scope of service, as well as develop an interlocal agreement, make sure that roles and responsibilities are locked into place. With that, then the normal procurement process will occur, and then we anticipate a project kickoff at the end of the year. Next slide. So start thinking about what area in your community might need this program or might benefit from this program. If you have any questions, please please contact me or Andrew Tellman, and we can provide you more information on the Livable Center Study Program. This concludes my presentation, and I will answer any questions the subcommittee has.
Thank you, Mr. Fizikas. Are there any questions for Mr. Fizikas? I hear none. We can move on to the next item. Mr. Kelman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next item on the agenda is to review the fiscal year 2022 and 2023 Unified Planning Work Program, or the UPWP, and I will be presenting this item. We can go to the next slide. The UPWP is a federally required planning document that identifies upcoming transportation planning activities. The RTC is currently operating under a UPWP that covers a 2-year planning period that ends this June 30th. So the new UPWP will again cover 2 years, and it will start on July 1st of this year and carry us through the year 2023. Next slide, please. In terms of funding available, the MPO receives approximately $3.3 million annually in federal transportation planning funds. For development of the new UPWP, the MPO started off fiscally constrained, meaning that the revenue anticipated to be available roughly matched the cost of funding core MPO planning needs and funding existing studies that have already been identified. So a call for new study proposals was not conducted this year. It should be noted that all existing local agency studies remain funded, and during meetings with all local agencies, project scopes were refined and funding adjustments were made to existing studies as needed. However, even with the limited funding we started off with, 2 new studies are able to be included in the new Unified Planning Work Program. The first new study is the Clark County Perfect Storm Special Events Management Study. This study will gather data, coordinate with stakeholders, and develop a traffic and mobility management plan for the resort corridor area during scenarios where multiple special events occur simultaneously. The other new study is the RTC's Transportation System Management and Operations, or TSMO, Business Case Study Development. This is a smaller and quicker TSMO-related study that will help the region determine the desirability of pursuing a full-scale TSMO plan. So it's related to ITS and traffic management systems. Next slide, please. This slide is intended to provide an overall framework of the UPWP and help understand what activities are being funded. Core MPO transportation planning tasks are contained in the first 3 task categories of 101, 201, and 202. Task 301s contains identified transportation studies. Task 302 is for ITS and operations types plans, typically to be led by the RTC's FAST division. And finally, Task 501 and 601 are related to administering the transportation elements of the Southern Nevada Strong Regional Plan. Next slide. And I just want to highlight some of the core activities that the MPO performs on an ongoing recurring basis and that are included in the new Unified Planning Work Program. First is development of the Transportation Improvement Program and maintenance of it through regular amendments that occur throughout the year. We also have development of the regional travel demand model, and especially relevant now is the various travel surveys that feed into the model, like the household travel survey that is conducted once every 10 years. And we have that study identified for kickoff next year. We also have development and implementation of a performance-based planning and programming project prioritization process, environmental justice and Title VI reporting, and the equity analysis related to specific transportation planning studies. And finally, as part of a core MPO function, we have an update to the Southern Nevada Freight Plan that has just recently begun. And next slide, yeah. Finally, I want to highlight a few transportation studies included in the UPWP. These studies will be getting underway soon in FY22. The first is the Northwest Las Vegas Traffic Study, and working with the City of Las Vegas, this will likely be the first study to be initiated from the new UPWP. Next is the Regional Transit Center Study that will help identify potential new mobility hubs around the valley. And this is an implementation item from the recently completed onboard mobility plan. There is also the Regional High-Speed Rail Station Connection Study that will identify improved transportation access to the proposed high-speed rail station located at Las Vegas Boulevard South and Warm Springs Road. And also included in this upcoming year is the Henderson Sustainable Mobility Plan, Livable Center Study that Danny Fazekas just provided an overview of, and a regional bicycle and sidewalk inventory using LiDAR technology. In the second year of the UPWP, so in the out year in 2023, there is a planned update to the Regional Bicycle and Pedestrian Plan. And after coordinating with the local agencies during UPWP development, this update to the Regional Bike and Ped Plan will include a high-level analysis of potential protected bicycle facilities located throughout the region and bicycle boulevards. There is also the Infrastructure Planning for Emerging Technology Study which will examine how new transportation technologies may impact assumptions made by the MPO as we prepare long-range regional transportation plans that forecast over 20 years into the future. And finally, there are 3 surveys planned that will provide direct inputs into the regional travel demand model. These are the Household Travel Survey, the Las Vegas Valley Visitor Survey, and the Transit Travel Survey. So all 3 of those surveys will feed into development of the travel demand model. And that concludes my presentation. I can answer any questions the subcommittee may have.
Thank you, Mr. Kelman. Any questions from any member? Hear none, we can move on to the next item. Again, Mr. Kelman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next item is to receive regional staff updates. And so this is an opportunity for subcommittee members to share updates or information with the committee.
Anybody would like to share something?
Mr. Chair, this is Fred Soley, City of Las Vegas. I'd like to give you guys a brief update on our master plan.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So as a quick update, Planning Commission recommended approval of the plan on April 13th. It'll be considered for adoption by the City Council on May 19th. The master plan builds on Southern Nevada Strong and offers guidance in regard to land use, environmental conservation, economic development, and public infrastructure for the City of Las Vegas. In terms of land use, the plan emphasizes infill and transit-oriented development and introduces new land use categories to reflect this emphasis. So upon the adoption of the plan, one of our first implementation actions will be to create new TOD zoning categories for use in conjunction with these new land use categories that we've created. These new zoning districts are currently in development, but we expect to have them completed by the end of the year. Everyone an update once we get that sorted out. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Solis. Anybody else?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, this is Mario Bermudez with Clark County.
Go ahead, Mario.
Thank you. A very quick update on our Transform Clark County project. Right now, we are in the midst of gathering comments on our area-specific policies. These are the policies related to our various planning areas or unincorporated towns, such as Spring Valley, Paradise, Winchester. We'll be gathering the comments online as well as going out to the various town boards, and that's through May 31st. We anticipate in July of this year that there'll be a public review document for the first draft of the Transform Clark County Master Plan Update, and that will be available for review. Also, the second part of the project, the Development Code Update, we're anticipating on June 1st to Planning Commission and June 2nd to a Board of County Commissioners, a presentation from our consultants dealing with the assessment of our code, where they think at this time things can be improved, the introduction of new zoning category names, and a restructuring of the development code. And that's where we are at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bermudez. Anybody else?
Yeah, this is Jody Bechtel with Clark County. I'll provide a brief update on Clark County's All-In Clark County initiative, which is our Sustainability and Climate Action Planning initiative. Hopefully a lot of you are aware we are updating the Southern Nevada Regional Planning Coalition's 2014 Regional Greenhouse Gas Emissions Plan. We're in the middle of that. And shortly in the next couple of months, we will be kicking off a regional climate vulnerability study and a community sustainability and climate action plan. So if anyone is interested in more information on that, feel free to contact me directly.
Thank you, Ms. Bechtel. Anybody else? Okay, I think that concludes item 9. Let's move on to the next item. Mr. Kelman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The last item on the agenda is your final citizens participation period.
Chairman Dimitrios Karapanagiottis for the record. This is the second time set aside for public comment. Just a reminder that comments will be limited to the first 500 words, with the remaining words to be included in the written record. Do we have any comments?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Reagan Lively, again for the record. There are no public comments at this time. Mr. Chairman, that concludes the final public comments for this item.
Thank you, Ms. Lively. If there are no additional comments, I will close the item. If there is nothing else from the committee, then this meeting is adjourned. Thank you all.